The Hunt Game. Chapter 1. The Unseen Tracker. Jack Reacher didn't plan to stop in Pine Ridge, a forgotten little town in New Mexico. His intentions were simple: get a strong cup of coffee, buy a new toothbrush, and move on. But fate, as usual, had other plans. The faded diner sign on the outskirts of town looked inviting, and Reacher figured a break wouldn't hurt. The diner's interior was dimly lit, with a few empty tables scattered around. An elderly couple sat quietly in a corner, and a bored waitress stood behind the counter. Reacher chose a seat at the back and placed his order. As he waited, he noticed something peculiar. Across the street, two men in a black sedan seemed to be watching the diner. Their glances were subtle, but Reacher could feel their focus on the building. It was a familiar feeling, the sense of being watched, followed. He had felt it countless times before, usually right before trouble hit. The waitress returned with his coffee, and Reacher decided to test the waters. "Do you know those guys parked out front?" She squinted out the window, frowning. "Never seen them before. They've been sitting there for a while, but they're not from around here." Reacher nodded, taking a sip of the bitter brew. The taste matched the undercurrent of tension he sensed. This town seemed too quiet, like it was hiding a dark secret. And now, he was part of it. Curiosity pushed him to stroll down Main Street, his movements slow and casual. The men in the car didn't budge, their eyes still locked on the diner. Reacher approached them, knocking on the car window. "You need something?" The men exchanged surprised glances. The driver tried to sound tough. "Mind your own business, big guy." Reacher grinned. "This is my business now." The men didn't realize it, but they had just ignited Reacher's instinct for conflict. He wasn't the type to back down from a threat. In fact, he thrived on it. He needed to know why he was being watched. But before he could press further, the passenger pulled a gun. "This isn't your concern, buddy." Reacher reacted swiftly, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it until the weapon clattered to the ground. In one smooth motion, he disarmed the driver too, tossing the guns aside. "Now we can talk," he said calmly. "You're making a big mistake," the driver muttered, rubbing his sore wrist. "Wouldn't be the first time," Reacher replied, "but this time, I want answers." The tension's rising, and Reacher's in the thick of it. Want to see what happens next? Subscribe now and share to keep the suspense going. Chapter 2. A Trap. Revealed. Reacher's grip was firm, his eyes locked on the driver, demanding answers. The men seemed reluctant, but they sensed there was no escaping Reacher's intimidating presence. "You're not just passing through, are you?" the passenger asked, rubbing his wrist and trying to regain his composure. Reacher's voice was cold. "Who hired you to watch me?" The men hesitated before the driver finally spoke. "It's not personal, just business. We're supposed to track you, report your movements." "Who sent you?" Reacher pressed, his gaze unwavering. The driver shook his head. "Can't say. They're paying well, and they don't like loose ends." Reacher wasn't satisfied with vague answers. He knew he needed more details to understand the game being played. He released his hold, stepping back, but keeping his stance ready for any sudden moves. "If you value your lives, start talking," he warned. The passenger, clearly rattled, blurted out, "The target isn't just you. There's a bigger game here. We were told you'd be a problem and that we had to watch you closely." Reacher felt the familiar chill of danger run down his spine. He was in the crosshairs of someone who knew his patterns, his moves. But this was different. It was more calculated, more personal. It wasn't just about surveillance. It was about manipulation. Someone wanted to control the narrative and possibly force Reacher into a trap. As Reacher considered his next move, the driver's phone buzzed. He checked the screen, his face going pale. "We need to go," he muttered to his partner. Reacher caught a glimpse of the screen, a simple message that read, "Abort mission. Leave now." But Reacher wasn't about to let them walk away. He grabbed the phone from the driver's hand, scrolling through the recent messages. He found only one useful clue, a number with the initials GC attached. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Tell your boss I'll be coming," Reacher said calmly, tossing the phone back to the driver. The men drove off without another word. leaving a trail of dust and uncertainty in their wake. Reacher watched them disappear down the road, his mind racing. Whoever this mysterious GC was, they had underestimated Jack Reacher. He wasn't just a target, he was a force to be reckoned with. Returning to the diner, Reacher ordered another coffee. He needed to think, to piece together the limited information he had. The waitress approached, curious. "Did you figure out who those guys were?" "Not yet," Reacher replied, "but I will." As he sipped his coffee, Reacher noticed a small envelope placed discreetly on his table. It was unmarked, except for a simple handwritten note. "Turn around." Reacher didn't flinch. He had a sense of who might be behind him, but he wasn't about to play their game. Instead, he scanned the room through the reflection on the stainless steel napkin holder. A tall figure wearing a dark coat stood near the entrance, watching him intently. Reacher's instincts kicked in. He turned slowly, locking eyes with the stranger. The man's expression was cold, calculated. "GC sent you?" Reacher asked, his tone calm but menacing. The man smirked. "I'm just here to deliver a message. You're in over your head, Reacher. This is a hunt, and you're the prey." Reacher stood up, his towering frame making the stranger hesitate for a split second. "Then I'd better start hunting back," he said. "Things are heating up and Reacher's just getting started. Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe and share if you want to see how this hunt unfolds." Chapter 3. The bait is set. The tall stranger's words hung in the air like a dark omen. Reacher's instinct screamed at him to dig deeper, but he knew that moving too quickly could trigger an ambush. Whoever was orchestrating this hunt had invested time and effort to track him. It wasn't just about eliminating him, it was about drawing him into something bigger. Reacher decided to play along, for now. As he left the diner, the stranger had already vanished into the shadowy alleyways of Pine Ridge. The streets were quiet, a deceptive calm that only heightened Reacher's suspicion. He scanned his surroundings, searching for anything out of place. Nothing, but he knew better than to rely on sight alone. He trusted his instincts, which had kept him alive in countless situations before. Reacher made his way to the town's small library. It was a long shot, but he needed to search for any information on the initials. GC, the librarian, a middle-aged woman with curious eyes, greeted him cautiously. "Can I help you with something?" "Yes," Reacher said, his voice low. "I'm looking for any records, local articles, or anything that might be connected to someone, or something, with the initials GC." The librarian raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. She led Reacher to a dusty archive room filled with newspapers and old records. As Reacher sifted through the documents, a headline caught his eye. "GC Corporation buys Pine Ridge land." The article was from a few months earlier, detailing a shadowy corporation's purchase of large tracts of land around town. It didn't provide much detail, but it hinted at something bigger. "Find what you were looking for?" the librarian asked, as she re-entered the room, her tone genuinely curious. "Not everything," Reacher replied, folding the article and tucking it into his jacket. "But it's a start." As he stepped out of the library, Reacher's phone vibrated in his pocket, a rare occurrence since he barely used it. The message was simple. "The game isn't over, Reacher. Meet me at 2nd Street Warehouse, midnight." Reacher's lips curled into a half smile. The hunter was trying to lure him to a specific location, likely setting up an ambush. It was reckless to walk into a trap, but Reacher knew that sometimes the best way to uncover the truth was to confront danger head-on. As midnight approached, Reacher made his way toward the warehouse. It was an old, dilapidated building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by empty lots and rusting fences. He approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. The door creaked open easily, almost too easily, but Reacher pushed inside without hesitation. The interior was dimly lit, filled with abandoned machinery and broken crates. Reacher's footsteps echoed, but he sensed he wasn't alone. Then he heard it, a faint rustle, followed by the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. "You actually showed up," a voice said from the darkness. It was the same tall man from earlier, his outline barely visible in the shadows. Reacher stood still, calm. "If you're going to pull the trigger, do it now. Otherwise, I'm coming for you." The man hesitated, his voice faltering. "This isn't about killing you, Reacher. It's about what you know." Reacher moved swiftly, closing the distance between them in a blur of motion. He disarmed the man with a single strike, then pressed him against a nearby wall. "Start talking." "The GC Corporation. They're after something here in Pine Ridge," the man gasped. "But it's not just about land, it's about control, the control over people, money, everything." Reacher's eyes narrowed. "Who's behind it? Names?" The man shook his head, his voice trembling. "You're already in too deep. They'll kill you before you get close." Reacher released his grip, letting the man slump to the ground. "Tell them I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice cold and resolute. The man's eyes were filled with fear, but also a hint of admiration. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Reacher stepped back. "Quitting isn't in my nature." As he left the warehouse, Reacher felt the weight of the hunt closing in around him. The shadows were darker, the stakes higher. But he wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. The hunt is getting deadlier and Reacher's going deeper into enemy territory. Stay tuned by subscribing and sharing. You won't want to miss the next twist. Chapter 4. The Deadly Setup. Reacher's night was far from over. As he made his way back into town, the clues he had gathered were starting to connect in a disturbing pattern. Pine Ridge was not just a pit stop, it was the epicenter of a well-coordinated plan. The initials GC were more than a name. They represented a powerful organization, willing to cross any line to achieve its goals. And now, it was clear, they wanted Reacher gone. It was almost dawn when Reacher reached the small motel where he had rented a room. He paused before entering, his senses alert. He noticed a slight movement near one of the windows, a faint shift in the curtain that lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Someone was inside, waiting for him. Reacher didn't go through the front door. Instead, he circled around the back, climbing up to the second floor using a drain pipe. He slipped through an unlocked window and moved silently down the dim hallway. As he approached his room, he heard low voices on the other side of the door. "Are you sure he's coming back here?" one voice asked, sounding impatient. "He will," another answered confidently. "He won't know what hit him." Reacher smirked at the irony. In a swift motion, he kicked the door open, catching the two men inside by surprise. They fumbled for their weapons, but Reacher was faster. He knocked the gun out of the first man's hand and sent him crashing against the wall. The second man swung at him, but Reacher countered with a powerful blow to the jaw, sending him to the ground. With both men disarmed and dazed, Reacher grabbed one of them by the collar. "Who sent you?" The man's face twisted in pain, but he managed to speak. "You were supposed to die tonight. Orders from the top." Reacher's eyes darkened. "Who's at the top?" But before the man could answer, a shot rang out from the hallway. The bullet whizzed past Reacher, barely missing him, and hit the man in the chest. Reacher dropped to the floor as the second gunman tried to scramble to his feet, panicking. Reacher moved quickly, grabbing the second gunman by the arm and using him as a human shield. "Who's the shooter?" he demanded, but the terrified man couldn't speak. Reacher knew he had to act fast. He lunged toward the open door, spotting a figure fleeing down the stairwell. He gave chase, his heavy boots pounding the steps as he pursued the shadowy figure out of the motel and into the darkened streets. The chase was short. Reacher tackled the man to the ground near an abandoned storefront. "Who are you working for?" Reacher demanded, pinning him down. The man struggled, his voice filled with panic. "I don't know their names, just the initials GC, that's all I know." Reacher's grip tightened. "You're lying. You don't survive this game without knowing who's behind it." The man's face was pale with fear. All right, I don't know much, but I heard something about a man called Grant Carrion. He's the one who calls the shots." Reacher felt a jolt of recognition. Grant Carrion, a name from his past. A ruthless arms dealer turned corporate tycoon, Carrion was known for his underhanded methods and complete disregard for human life. He had crossed paths with Reacher once before, in a deadly standoff that left several of Carrion's men dead. "This isn't over," Reacher said, releasing the man with a final shove. "Tell Carrion I'm coming for him." The man nodded quickly, terrified. "I will. Just don't kill me." Reacher watched as the man stumbled away. then turned and walked into the silent streets. The hunt was no longer just a mystery, it was personal. Carrion had unfinished business with Reacher, and now it was clear that he was using Pine Ridge as a base for his latest scheme. Reacher felt a cold sense of resolve wash over him. He would track Carrion down, but first, he needed to understand what was at stake in Pine Ridge. He knew one thing for certain: the bait had been set and the hunters were closing in. But this time Reacher was ready to turn the game on its head. Reacher's hunt is turning personal, and the stakes are higher than ever. Stay with us for the next chapter. Subscribe and share to follow this thrilling chase. Chapter 5. The Face of the Enemy. Reacher knew it was time to escalate. As he stood in the cold morning air of Pine Ridge, he was no longer just tracking clues. He was preparing for a confrontation with a man who had made it personal. Grant Carrion, a figure Reacher thought he had left in the past, was clearly the mastermind behind the hunt. Reacher's next step was to draw Carrion out into the open. Reacher decided to visit the largest real estate office in town, which was rumored to be under Carrion's control. The building was newer than the rest, with tinted windows that obscured the view inside. Reacher entered, his heavy footsteps echoing in the sterile lobby. The receptionist, a polished woman in her mid-30s, greeted him with a professional smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I need to speak to the person in charge," Reacher said bluntly. The woman's smile faltered. "Do you have an appointment?" "I don't need one," Reacher replied, his tone firm. "Tell Carrion that Jack Reacher is here to see him." The mention of Reacher's name visibly rattled the woman. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed a number on the phone. After a brief, hushed conversation, she nodded to Reacher. "You can go in. He's waiting for you." Reacher's eyes narrowed. He wasn't expecting Carrion to be so accessible, but he also knew this was likely another trap. Still, he walked through the heavy wooden doors into an elegantly furnished office. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat Grant Carrion, the man who had orchestrated this deadly game. Carrion was older than Reacher remembered, his hair grayer and his face lined with years of ruthlessness, but his eyes were as cold and calculating as ever. He stood up, offering a twisted smile. "Jack Reacher, I knew you'd find your way here eventually." Reacher didn't bother with pleasantries. "What's your game, Carrion?" Carrion laughed, the sound echoing ominously in the spacious room. "No game, Reacher, just business. Pine Ridge is the perfect testing ground for my operations and you happen to wander into it. But now, you're a complication." "Testing ground?" Reacher asked, his voice low and dangerous. Carrion leaned forward, his tone suddenly serious. "I have plans for this town. Strategic investments, if you will. The land here has hidden potential, resources that no one knows about yet. I plan to capitalize on it before the competition even realizes what's happening." Reacher's fists clenched. "You've killed people for this, used them as pawns." Carrion shrugged, unfazed. "Collateral damage, Reacher. It's nothing personal. You know how it works." Reacher stepped closer, towering over Carrion's desk. "Well, this just became personal. You made a mistake coming after me." Carrion's eyes flashed with a mix of arrogance and amusement. "You think you can stop me? Pine Ridge is just the beginning. You're out of your depth, Reacher." Before Reacher could respond, a sudden burst of gunfire erupted from outside the office. Carrion's guards rushed in, pistols drawn, but Reacher was faster. He grabbed the edge of the desk and flipped it toward the guards, using it as cover. Carrion ducked behind a bookshelf, barking orders. "Kill him now!" Reacher moved with precision, taking out two of the guards in quick succession. He grabbed one of their guns, using it to neutralize the remaining attackers. As the last guard fell, Reacher turned to find Carrion trying to escape through a side door. Reacher pursued him, catching up, just as Carrion reached a black SUV idling in the back alley. He slammed the door shut before Carrion could enter, grabbing the man by the collar. "Going somewhere?" Carrion's face twisted with a mix of fear and rage. "You won't get away with this, Reacher." Reacher's grip tightened. "I'm not looking to get away. I'm here to finish this." But before he could deliver a final blow, Carrion's phone buzzed. He managed to pull it out and held it up for Reacher to see. The screen displayed a countdown timer, rapidly approaching 0. "This whole building is rigged," Carrion said with a sinister smile. "You might stop me, but you won't stop what's coming." Reacher knew Carrion wasn't bluffing. He had only seconds to react. He threw Carrion aside and bolted toward the exit, adrenaline surging through his veins. The explosion hit just as Reacher dived behind a nearby dumpster, the shockwave throwing debris and fire into the night sky. Reacher stood, coughing through the smoke, his body aching but alive. Carrion had slipped away in the chaos, but Reacher wasn't done yet. The hunt was far from over. The stakes are explosive and Reacher's not backing down. Don't miss the final showdown. Subscribe and share to see how it all ends. Chapter 6. The Final Strike. Smoke lingered in the air as Reacher emerged from the ruins of Carrion's office, bruised but relentless. He knew Carrion would use the chaos to regroup, but Reacher wasn't about to let him escape Pine Ridge. His body was sore from the blast, but his focus was sharper than ever. This hunt had gone too far and Reacher was determined to end it. He quickly made his way to the outskirts of town, where the remnants of Carrion's operation were likely to be hidden. As dawn approached, Reacher reached an old abandoned mill, a place he had seen on the map earlier. It was secluded, isolated by tall trees and overgrown vegetation, the perfect spot for a final standoff. Reacher approached quietly, keeping low to avoid detection. He noticed two guards posted at the main entrance, both heavily armed. They were alert, scanning the area, but they hadn't spotted Reacher. He crept closer, using the darkness to his advantage, and took down the first guard silently with a precise chokehold. The second guard barely had time to react before Reacher disarmed him and delivered a knockout punch. The inside of the mill was filled with crates, maps, and high-tech surveillance equipment. It was clear that Carrion had turned the building into a command center. As Reacher moved deeper inside, he found Carrion standing alone in the center of the room, flanked by more armed men. Carrion's expression was a mix of frustration and resignation. "You really don't know when to stop, do you, Reacher?" Reacher's gaze was steely. "I don't stop until it's over. You should know that by now." Carrion signaled to his men, who moved forward with guns raised. Reacher didn't hesitate. He lunged to the side, grabbing a heavy metal pipe and swinging it with lethal precision. He disarmed two of the guards quickly, using their weapons against them. The room filled with gunfire and shouts, but Reacher's combat skills gave him the upper hand. Within moments, the remaining guards were either down or retreating. Only Carrion remained, his face pale but defiant. He reached for a concealed pistol, but Reacher was faster. He kicked the gun out of Carrion's hand, sending it skidding across the floor. "Face it, Carrion," Reacher said, his voice low but filled with finality. "It's over." Carrion glared at Reacher, rage and desperation burning in his eyes. "You think taking me down will stop this? There are others like me. You can't win." Reacher stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over Carrion. "Maybe, but you won't be around to see it." Carrion, sensing his defeat, tried one last desperate move, reaching for a knife strapped to his ankle. But Reacher anticipated the move, countering with a swift strike that disarmed Carrion and sent him crashing to the ground. With Carrion immobilized, Reacher knew he had to make a decision. The authorities would take hours to reach Pine Ridge, and Carrion's influence could easily buy him freedom if Reacher left him alive. But killing Carrion in cold blood wasn't Reacher's style. He believed in justice, even if it was slow and imperfect. "You're going to prison, Carrion," Reacher said, his voice unyielding. "And this time, there won't be any escape." Carrion laughed bitterly. "You really think you're making a difference?" Reacher didn't respond. Instead, he bound Carrion's hands with a rope he found nearby, securing him to a support beam. He then picked up a phone and dialed a contact he knew he could trust, a federal agent he'd crossed paths with in the past. "I've got a package for you in Pine Ridge," Reacher said into the phone. "Grant Carrion, alive but not happy." As he waited for the authorities to arrive, Reacher stood over Carrion, his presence imposing and resolute. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. Reacher knew he'd soon be back on the road, chasing new leads, facing new enemies. For now, though, Pine Ridge was safe. The hunt had ended, and Reacher was already thinking about his next destination, where new dangers and challenges awaited him. As the sound of approaching sirens grew louder, Reacher took one last look at Carrion. "Game over," he said simply. then turned and walked into the early morning light, ready for whatever came next. The end.
If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.